China. Winter is here, folks. The United States and China have an extremely tense relationship that is only becoming more tense as the days go on. Last week, China and the United States sat down for a summit in Anchorage, Alaska. It was the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, as well as the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. They went to Anchorage, Alaska. They met with their respective Chinese counterparts, and they were supposed to have this diplomatic meeting. Now, I'm going to explain to you what happened during that so-called diplomatic meeting, the very tense exchange that happened where China essentially pointed the finger at the United States and said, quit being a hypocrite. You guys are imperial warmongers. And the United States pointed at China and said, you're committing acts of genocide and human rights abuses. And that tense exchange has carried on. And now we're seeing some sanctions that have been issued today against China. And China has now responded with some sanctions against the United States. And things are just looking more and more drab between the two countries. So let's go ahead and break down exactly what happened. I'm going to read to you a little bit of the transcript because it's extremely telling about where we're headed and really how the world looks at the United States. Because in a lot of ways on this, China is not wrong. I do think that China is our main competitor, and we should absolutely be keeping our eyes on China when it comes to competition, and we should have a competitive relationship with China. We should also be limiting China's ability to come to the United States and buy up resources. That is something that China is doing that is our fault as a country because we allow it in our laws. Now, what Trump was trying to do was try to get China to relax their own laws so that American businessmen could go over to China and do to China what China's allowed to do to the United States. But China says not so fast. That's just not the way they operate. That has created a very hostile sort of trade environment between the United States and China. There is also some currency manipulation happening on China's part. And there's also what seems like unfair trade practices. And in some cases, you could say maybe, but a lot of it has more to do with the fact that we allow China to do it. It's about our hyper-capitalism that just kind of allows for no rules for big corporations and businesses. And China takes advantage of those rules, but they're playing by the rules. And if we don't like those rules, we really need to change them. And I believe we should change them in order to limit the ability for China and other countries to come into our country, buy up businesses, buy up land, buy up homes, all of these things. So that being said, the narrative, however, that we're hearing from the West about China, all of the narratives we're hearing in our media, much of that is, I would say, false accusations or exaggerated in order to demonize China. And the reason why you need to pay attention to this is because the purpose of that is to maintain, I believe, and I'm going to show this to you in this segment. It is what I believe is to maintain a Cold War attitude towards China so that we can continue to and start proxy wars using actual military aggression and cyber military aggression. And in order to continue the military industrial complex, to continue U.S. warmongering imperialism. And so we are continuing down the path of what we already know and what we've already used many, many times before, which is that finger pointing, claiming that there's a lot of atrocities going on by this country so that we would then have the American sympathy of the American public to essentially wage war. So we need to pay attention to that because I know a lot of people seem to be falling into this trap. I'm hearing a lot of people who are fundamentally aware of this strategy by the U.S. against places like Venezuela, Syria, you name it, Russia, right? A lot of people are really aware of this strategy. But then suddenly, when it comes to China, they say, oh, yeah, but China really is bad. And I'm going to show you today in this segment that that's not exactly the case, that this is just, again, another narrative in order to continue that Cold War strategy, in order to continue that military industrial complex, and now more of a cyber military industrial complex. We're seeing those big tech companies getting in on those military industrial complex contracts, which, by the way, were facilitated by Tony Blinken before he was Secretary of State. And so we're just going to see a heightened new level of aggressions with China that is going to continue these proxy wars and continue us on this path of this sort of proxy imperialism that the United States has been on for a very long time, that many of us are absolutely sick of and aware of. And China points it out in this Anchorage, Alaska meeting. So let me just read to you some of the transcript. So this right here is, so the four men got together, and Tony Blinken starts off and he's talking and he's like, he says all the diplomatic stuff like, good afternoon, welcome, thanks for being here. And he was given 2 minutes to speak. Okay, so he writes up this speech for 2 minutes and he says things like, here's a little bit from it. He says, we'll discuss our deep concerns with actions by China, including in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, cyber attacks on the United States, and economic coercion toward our allies. Each of these actions threaten the rules-based order that maintains global stability. That's why they're not merely internal matters and why we feel an obligation to raise these issues here today. He says, I said that the United States relationship with China will be competitive where it should be, collaborative where it can be, adversarial where it must be. So here's Tony Blinken really iron fist, we will be adversarial where we must be. So he goes on and says, our discussions here in Alaska, I suspect, will run the gamut. Our intent is to be direct about our concerns, direct about our priorities with the goal of a more clear-eyed relationship between our countries moving forward. So, he basically, in his 2-minute spiel, and Jake Sullivan is also given that, and they're kind of giving their little warm welcome to China, right? Because they're welcoming them to the U.S. on Alaskan soil. And then they immediately, right away in this meeting that's supposed to be diplomatic, within the 2 minutes, they immediately say, hey, China, we got some issues with you, with your human rights abuses in these regions. We don't like that. And we're going to be adversarial where we need to be. So Jake Sullivan kind of says something very similar. And then China gets their chance to respond. And China was supposed to take 2 minutes. But what happened was when China arrived in Alaska, the day before they showed up to this diplomatic meeting, the United States issued fresh sanctions on China concerning the Hong Kong, I believe, is what they were issuing the sanctions on. So China thought, well, that's odd. On our first meeting, the day before our first meeting with the new administration, you guys issue sanctions on us about Hong Kong. So they already knew this wasn't going to be a warm welcome. This wasn't going to be a meeting where they were going to try to have repair the relationship after Donald Trump. They knew that this was going to be hostile going in. So China, rather than giving a 2-minute sort of response to Tony Blinken's 2-minute opening, they talked for 17 minutes. So well beyond the 2 minutes that they were supposed to be given. And in those 17 minutes, they said a lot because they were feeling attacked. They were feeling like, okay, you're coming at us. We know you're coming at us with these things. So you know what, U.S., let us give you a dose of your own medicine. And what China says, I think, resonates with a lot of us in the United States, okay? A lot of what many of us are feeling. So let's hear let me just read to you a little bit of what the Chinese, he's not an ambassador, but the representative, like basically the Secretary of State, essentially equivalent. So he says, China has made, and this is all through a translator, but he says, China has also made historic achievements in building the country into a moderately prosperous one in all respects. The Chinese people are wholly rallying around the Communist Party of China. Our values are the same as the common values of humanity. Those are peace, development, fairness, justice, freedom, and democracy. So I thought that was interesting that he mentions democracy in there, because a lot of people, I think, myself included, have this idea that China doesn't have a democracy. So he says, what China and the international community follow or uphold is a United Nations-centered international system and the international order underpinned by international law, not what is advocated by a small number of countries of the so-called rules-based international order. And the United States has its style, United States-style democracy, and China has the Chinese-style democracy. It's not just up to the American people, but also the people of the world to evaluate how the United States has done in advancing its own democracy. So he's calling out the United States for advancing our brand of democracy, saying, it's not up to just you guys, but it's up to everybody to discuss how you Americans have been advancing your idea of democracy, which many of us know has been through military aggression, regime change, proxy wars, aiming nukes at other countries, that sort of thing. So he says, in China's case, after decades of reform and opening up, we have come a long way in various fields. In particular, we have engaged in tireless efforts to contribute to the peace and development of the world and to upholding the purpose and principles of the UN Charter. The wars in this world are launched by some other countries, which have resulted in massive casualties. But for China, what we have asked for other countries is to follow a path of peaceful development. And this is the purpose of our foreign policy. We do not believe in invading through the use of force or to topple other regimes through various means or to massacre the people of other countries, because all of those would only cause turmoil and instability in this world. And at the end of the day, all of those would not serve the United States well. So he's calling out the United States for exactly what the U.S. has been doing since World War II, which is going around the world and exerting a foreign policy that is using military might. And he's right. China does not do that. China has one military base, I believe, in Djibouti. And that's the only military base not inside of China that China has. And so, there's a lot of talk about, China, and they're doing all of these military aggressions in the South China Sea and whatnot. But to be fair, China doesn't, comparatively to the United States, do anything aggressive towards other countries. So they're right when they're pointing the finger at the United States. And he says right here, so we believe that it is important for the United States to change its own image and to stop advancing its own democracy in the rest of the world. Many people within the United States actually have little confidence in the democracy of the United States, and they have various views regarding the government of the United States. So he's very right on that. He goes on to say, China and the United States are both major countries and both shoulder important responsibilities. We must both contribute to the peace, stability, and development of the world in areas such as COVID-19, restoring economic activities in the world, and responding to climate change. There are many things that we can do together and where our interests converge. So what we need to do is abandon the Cold War mentality and the zero-sum game approach. We must change the way we think and make sure that in this century, the 21st century, countries big or small, particularly the big countries, should come united together to contribute to the future of humanity and build a community with a shared future for humankind. It is also important for all of us to come together to build a new type of international relations, ensuring fairness, justice, and mutual respect. And on some regional issues, I think the problem is that the United States has exercised long-arm jurisdiction and suppression and overstretched the national security through the use of force or financial hegemony. And this has created obstacles for normal trade activities, and the United States has also been persuading some countries to launch attacks on China. Goes on and says, on human rights, we hope that the United States will do better on human rights. So Tony Blinken, first and says to China, you guys have been doing all these human rights abuses, Xinjiang region, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and we're calling you out on it, and we're going to be adversarial about it. And so China says, oh, you want to talk human rights abuses, do you, inside of your own country? So China's stance is what they were saying to the United States about those other sections, Tibet, Taiwan, Xinjiang, Hong Kong. They say these are internal affairs. Stay out of our business. Don't meddle in our business. And the United States, by the way, says that all the time, right? We say that to Russia. Don't meddle with our business. How dare you meddle in the United States issues? Like, you stay in your country, you've got your own problems. And yeah, we might have ours, but we're dealing with them and you better stay out of them. So China says the same thing to the United States, says stay out of our business. That's internal. It's none of your business. Get out of it. So they said to the United States on human rights, we hope that the United States will do better on human rights. China has made steady progress in human rights. And the fact is there are many problems within the United States regarding human rights, which is admitted by the U.S. itself as well. The United States has also said that countries can't rely on force in today's world to resolve the challenges we face, and it is a failure to use various means to topple the so-called authoritarian states. And the challenges facing the United States in human rights are deep-seated. They did not just emerge over the past 4 years, such as Black Lives Matter. It did not come up recently. So we do hope that for our two countries, it's important that we manage our respective affairs well instead of deflecting the blame on somebody else in this world. So the United States is, pointing the finger at China, saying you're committing all these human rights abuses. We don't like what you're doing with Hong Kong and their democracy. We don't like what you're doing in the Uyghur region, the Xinjiang region with the Uyghurs. And so we're going to point the finger at you and we're going to be adversarial with you about it. And China kind of looks at us and says, there's a lot we could be adversarial with you about, but we stay out of it. And so you guys should stay out of ours unless you want us to come around and start meddling in your affairs. So in regards to competition, the Chinese said China-U.S. trade has achieved a lot and we should do even better. The overwhelming majority of American businesses in China have said that China's business environment is good and nobody has forced them to stay in China. They see a profit coming from their presence in China. And I believe that for our two countries, under the new circumstances, we need to enhance communication, properly manage our differences, and expand our cooperation instead of engaging in confrontation. So they're calling America a bully. It says on cyber attacks, let me say that whether it's the ability to launch cyber attacks or the technologies that could be deployed, the United States is the champion in this regard. You can't blame this problem on somebody else. So it's like, oh, you want to talk cyber attacks? You guys are king. So how about you not point the finger at anybody else? Because you guys have got that. You guys are champs. You guys are the cyber attack champs. Says the United States itself does not represent international public opinion, and neither does the Western world. Whether judged by population scale or the trend of the world, the Western world does not represent the global public opinion. Now, he's right, because the vast majority of people in this world are Asian, Chinese, and Indian. They have, China alone, I think, has 5 times our population. So, and the West in general has, if we were to run the world purely on democracy, like the United States claims, right? The United States says, well, we believe in democracy. Well, if we really believed in democracy, then we would understand we are outnumbered by Asians. So by, the population of Asia is much greater than the population of the West. So if we really believe in democracy, we would not be ruling the world. Says that we hope that when talking about universal values or international public opinion on the part of the United States, we hope the U.S. side will think about whether it feels reassured in saying those things, because the U.S. does not represent the world. It only represents the government of the United States. And I don't think that the overwhelming majority of countries in the world would recognize that the universal values advocated by the United States or that of the opinion of the United States could represent international public opinion. And those countries would not recognize that the rules made by a small number of people would serve as the basis for the international order. So they're right on that. And then lastly here, just to kind of wrap up what the Chinese say, it says, and China certainly in the past has not, and in the future will not accept the unwarranted accusations from the U.S. side. In the past several years, China's legitimate rights and interests have come under outright suppression, plunging the China-U.S. relationship into a period of unprecedented difficulty. This has damaged the interests of our two peoples and taken its toll on world stability and development, and this situation must no longer continue. China urges the U.S. side to fully abandon the hegemonic practice of willfully interfering in China's internal affairs. This has been a long-standing issue and it should be changed. It is time for it to change. And in particular, on the 17th of March, the United States escalated its so-called sanctions on China regarding Hong Kong, and the Chinese people are outraged by this gross interference in China's internal affairs, and the Chinese side is firmly opposed to it. So, okay, as you can see, heated exchange in Alaska. China and the U.S. Taking jabs at one another. China in particularly really coming hard back at the United States. Of course, Anthony Blinken did not allow China to have the last word. They had 17 minutes of the last word when they were only supposed to have 2 minutes. So Anthony Blinken came back and basically just hit at China again and said, yeah, we're still not putting up with you. And we think that you're a big meanie that does a lot of bad things. And so we're going to call you out on it. And we're going to come after you for it, which is typical American way of being. So this is my frustration with the way we're going about going after China. China is a competitor. We absolutely need to keep our eyes on them. We absolutely need to be competing with them. And we need to be doing everything we can as a country to strengthen ourselves, strengthen our innovation, strengthen whatever it is we've got in order to compete, because China is a rising world power. And probably by 2050 will be the world power. So that is, 30 years from now, that's what the sort of estimation is that China will be overtaking as the number one world power in the next 30 years. And their strategy has been to develop friendships around the world. They've attempted to develop numerous friendships. They created this Belt and Road Initiative, and they started making friends and meeting with all these various countries around the world. And many of the countries were heavily ignored prior to China coming around. Africa, and a lot of people have their views on what China's doing to Africa. But, African people in Africa that are starting to see their countries develop are really liking the fact that they're entering into a more developed world. They're tired of being ignored. They're tired of being really like bastardized. And China comes along and says, listen, we will help you build up infrastructure. What does China want in exchange? China wants the ability to to include them in the Belt and Road Initiative. They see a lot of trade is how countries make a lot of money, how they become very wealthy. And so they're wanting to create this sort of chain this sort of, it's the Belt and Road of trade. And that is what China knows will elevate them to that big world power. And they're not wrong on that. And the United States knows this as well. That is why, if you pay attention, and I've done a segment on this before, and I could do a deeper dive onto it again, back into this again. But if you look around the world at that Belt and Road Initiative, you'll notice something really, really bizarre. You'll notice that all of the main points that China has gone and done deals for this new Belt and Road Initiative, you'll notice that there suddenly is somehow, suddenly, in the middle of Africa, or in Southeast Asia, places where you wouldn't expect, there's suddenly a rise in extremism. There's suddenly a rise in Islamists and terrorism. And ports get blown up, or facilities get damaged, or the country goes into civil unrest. And so what we're seeing is that the United States has not stopped the United States' continued tool in the toolbox, which is exporting extremism, training extremists, relying on those extremists to destabilize areas in order to keep countries occupied and unable to grow because they're too occupied battling extremists or in a civil war. You got that with Assad in Syria, and he's in a civil war. We're seeing all of these things. So it's interesting when you look through that Belt and Road Initiative, you're going to find port by port by port a rise in this extremism, a rise in terrorism. And then you got to scratch your head and wonder, that's odd. Why is there this rise in extremism in places like the Philippines, for example? Why is there this ISIS in the Philippines? Why is there this rise in extremism right all along that Belt and Road Initiative into Africa, into places that it shouldn't be? And this brings us to the sanctions that were handed to China today, which is on the Uyghurs. So the United States says you're committing an act of genocide, and the United States issues fresh sanctions against China. Now, China responded with their own set of sanctions against the United States. But let's talk about these Uyghurs for a little bit. So what the United States knows, and something that the Middle Eastern countries know as well, which is why there is no Middle Eastern country that is against China and what China is attempting to do in the Xinjiang region. There are no Middle Eastern countries. There's no Muslim majority, maybe Turkey, because Turkey's with NATO. I'd have to check on that again. But of the Middle Eastern Muslim majority nations, they actually they have issued statements of support for China and what China is attempting to do. That is very opposite of what the Western nations are doing. Christian majority countries, you could say, that are not even Muslim majority countries, that instead have a invested interest in not seeing the rise of China, instead go after China with what they're doing in the Xinjiang region. People in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, know that one of the hottest areas to recruit for ISIS and Al-Qaeda was in the Xinjiang region of China. The Uyghurs made up thousands upon thousands of ISIS and Al-Qaeda fighters. And that was something that was a bit of the fault of China themselves. They made the same mistake that the United States did when the United States started arming and training the Mujahideen in Afghanistan back in the late 70s and early 80s that ultimately rose up and became Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, right? So the United States armed and trained it was a big operation started under Carter, continued under Reagan, and it was a massive operation with billions of dollars that were poured into training and arming the Mujahideen, which ultimately is where Osama bin Laden came from. China did that same thing. So they were using that same strategy back in the day with their Uyghur region. They knew they had this sort of Muslim majority region in their country, and they were using that same sort of ideology, trying to promote it, trying to build it up, trying to arm these fighters in order to beat the Russians. So it was again, a concerted effort to sort of push the Soviets back. China was playing the same game the United States did, and now it's come back to bite them in the ass. And that is now they've got an area in their own country with Chinese citizens, so they cannot deport them somewhere. They don't have that option. An area of Chinese citizens where many of them are radicalized and growing in radicalization because many of those people are being recruited to Syria. They're being recruited to all of these areas where Al-Qaeda and ISIS are fighting. The United States knows this. Anybody who studies any foreign policy regarding ISIS and Al-Qaeda knows that is a huge funnel. The Uyghur region, the Uyghurs and the Xinjiang region is a huge funnel into those areas for fighting. The U.S. knows this. So guess what the U.S. also knows? The U.S. knows that the Syrian civil war has winded down, and that the extremist groups in the Middle East are being squashed, ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And now there's all these Uyghur fighters, and they're wanting to go home. And they go back to China. And the United States knows this. The U.S. has been waiting for this day, saying, oh, this is great. So we've got all these fighters who just got a lot of skills and weapons, and they've made a lot of connections, and they know how to organize, they know how to fight. They did all this training in the Middle East, and now they're going to go back to China. And now they've got ideas in their head that they want a separate region, that they want to break the Xinjiang region away from China, and they want to have their own nation. Now, most of the Uyghurs don't want this, but there are those that are radical, that are in this nationalist movement, and they do want this. Well, guess what? That Belt and Road Initiative, which is absolutely necessary for the rise of China to become the world power they're hoping to be within the next 30 years, has to go in and out of that Xinjiang region. It has to go in and out. So the United States is up to its old tricks again, which is essentially attempting to destabilize a region in order to keep some other for some other interest, to keep some other, an oil pipeline or a gas pipeline or the rise of, something to kind of halt growth or halt something that they don't want to have happen. And so that is what's going on. Now, that doesn't absolve China of human rights abuses. I absolutely believe that in every prison in the world, there are human rights abuses that are happening. Every prison in the world, here in the United States, we know that there are abuses in our prisons, and China could start coming after us for all of the human rights abuses in our prisons. They could say, look at your prisons. They're filled with black people. You guys are clearly committing acts of genocide against black folks, which many in the United States are saying, right? Many in the United States say we have an assault on our black population. Black Lives Matter. This is why China brings this up. And they say, you've got an ethnic minority group in your country, and you're incarcerating them essentially in mass. And then you're doing forced labor. And there's even reports of forced sterilization in your history in the United States. And we know this. And you guys are doing all of these things. Now, China doesn't say that to us. They stay out of our business. That is something that here in the United States, we deal with on an internal level, and we are attempting to reform. Prison reform, to me, is one of the biggest things. We absolutely need to do that. So, and the criminal justice system absolutely needs reform. And so we are taking that up as a country ourselves. We don't really need outside countries to sanction us or hit us in order to make that move, right? Because that would only harm us as a country even more. It doesn't really help us. It actually would just harm us. And so China's saying the same thing. They're like, look, we're dealing with an internal problem. We've got an issue. It's unlike your issue, but it's our issue, just like your issue is your issue. And we want you to stay out of ours. We're dealing with something, and you guys have your own stuff. So let's just, leave it alone, and let's just deal with things that we can work together on, trade issues and those types of things. So like I said, China's not absolved of human rights abuses that are going on in their prisons. Absolutely, I'm sure their prisons are no Disneyland. And I'm sure that there's a lot of abuses that happen in those prisons. But is it systemic genocide what's going on in the Uyghur region? I do not believe so. I absolutely don't think that that's what's going on. I don't think that, I do know people get out of these re-education camps. My grandfather went to a re-education camp for 4 years in Vietnam, got out. So these sort of camps are somewhat normal inside of Asian countries. They don't look at prison as punishment. Sometimes they look at it as rehabilitation, as re-education. But of course, it's still prison. So, you're still shoveling rocks or whatever it is you have to do in prison. So it's not fun by any means. And human rights abuses, absolutely. But we have to understand that as a country, the Chinese, there's over 1 billion of them. They can deal with their own issues. The Chinese people are able to, if there was something really sinister and bad going on in China, they would revolt. They have shown time and time again, the Chinese people, that they are willing to do this. They're not that oppressed. They will rise up. And there's enough of them to rise up. And the government knows that. They cannot control 1.3 billion people. So that is something that really is China's business. And the United States wants to make it an American sympathy issue, right? So they know if they throw the word genocide around, it really arouses a certain emotion in Americans that makes Americans rise up and say, oh my gosh, we have to do something. We must stop this atrocity. They're banking on that. They're banking on that feeling. And they're banking on enough Western world pressure against China that they're hoping China will then have to let out all the Uyghurs. And by doing that, by letting out these previous fighters that were fighting alongside ISIS and Al-Qaeda, many of them were not, but there are others that maybe showed a lot of sympathy for the fighters, or they helped the fighters by sending them packages, or, they were somehow showing sympathy towards those fighters, or they were somehow showing that they themselves were buying into the radicalization, that that same sort of thing. That's the people that they're kind of gathering up and putting in these re-education camps. Anybody who showed sympathy or participated in or seems interested in, right? They're kind of saying anybody, and you guys go. Now, that's not the way I want this country to run. I understand that that's not, my personal brand of what I view to be a free country. But again, I don't live in China. It's not my business. It's their business, and they can deal with it. And the Chinese people, I believe, can deal with it. They're not wimpy people. So it's just the United States once again hoping that China then has to end these camps, and in which case the Uyghur region would go into absolute civil unrest. It would go into a civil war. And there would be terrorist attacks. There have been numerous terrorist attacks in that region over the last decade or 15 years, numerous stabbings and other things and explosions and whatnot in that region. And they're banking on that. They don't want China to be able to do imports and exports out of that region. And they want China occupied with a civil war. They're also hoping China's occupied with a civil unrest in Hong Kong. All of this. This is what the U.S. is good at, what the U.S. knows, what the U.S. has done numerous times over and over again. And so we as Americans need to recognize it when it's happening and stand up and say, no, we do not want to go down this path. We've done this numerous times before. This just results in proxy wars and justification for continued military aggression and massive military budgets that are inflated and more military industrial complex stuff. And now, because it's China, you're going to inflate now these big tech companies, and they're going in bed with the Pentagon. And it's just going to get worse and worse. And we as Americans need to be able to recognize this when it's happening to us. Because right now, many of you, we all know that, okay, when it's going on in Venezuela, when it's going on in Syria, when it's going on these other places, we're aware of it. But I fear what's happening is we're not so aware of it when it's happening with China, that a lot of us are still a bit blinded and still believing in the official narrative. And I'm telling you, do not believe in that official narrative. It is not accurate. It is just a ploy in order to destabilize a region, in order to keep China from growing, in order to keep the U.S. the big imperial world power. And that is what is going on with China. So we will see how this unfolds. We all know how this usually does when it comes to when we have our sights on a target like this and we demonize them in this way. We all know kind of how this unfolds, and China does as well. But China's no Venezuela, and they're no Syria, and they're really no Russia either. They are more akin to the Soviets, to the USSR, but potentially stronger. And China is smart and can learn from the mistakes of that USSR and will avoid those mistakes to ensure that they do not fall in the same way and allow the US to continue being the sole world power running the world with military might. China's very smart. So, and they play the long game. They play the long game. They don't think in 4-year cycles like we do. They think in 100-year cycles, 200-year cycles. So that is what's going on with that. All right, we're going to take a little bit of a break. Let me get a drink of water and gather my thoughts. We're going to talk now about the U.S. They're talking about the Congress is talking about D.C. statehood. We're going to talk about that as well as a potential third wave. The media is getting us ready for another potential lockdown to happen probably next month. That is coming up. I'll be right back. 2 minutes.